Well, welcome everybody to the Rice Report here on August 3rd, 2023. We find ourselves in a very interesting position around the world. We are seeing the terms misinformation, disinformation used all over the world. And I think one area that people do not focus on is the fact that this, I call it a propaganda machine, actually reaches into every sector of the world, including financial statistics and financial outlook. So I'm going to focus a lot on that today as we progress. I'm going to do a lot of these financial overviews, but ultimately, in the end, the Rice Report will have a lot of religious outlooks and societal outlooks. But right now, there's so much happening financially that I think everyone in the world needs to understand the things that are actually happening in this world so that you can determine what you want to take away from it and that you can think critically and make better decisions in your life. That's really the purpose of this entire show. So I wanted to kick this off with some information that came out yesterday that has really kind of shaken up the world and will continue to shake up the world for a little while because nothing lasts forever in the news cycle. Everything seems to be drowned out. So whatever I'm telling you, I'm assuming Trump will be arrested tomorrow for it happening. No matter what happens, something else happens to distract us. But yesterday, S&P and Fitch downgraded the United States as a credit rating to a AA+ rating. This is the first time in recent history that this has happened. Now, a lot of people are confused as to what this means. It just means that the credit quality of the nation has deteriorated or been downgraded. If you notice that basically since 1970s, we have had our dollar backed by the full faith and confidence of the US government. So downgrading this nation actually downgrades a lot of confidence in the country. That's the big thing to look at from these credit ratings. This was immediately publicized by CNN, saying that, well, we were downgraded because of the debt ceiling drama caused by Republicans and by January 6th activities. That is nonsense. That has nothing to do with it. I'm going to kind of prove this here. And by the way, I'm not political at all. I'm not a Republican. I'm not a Democrat. I'm an American who's interested in learning the truth and looking through actual events to see what's really happening in the world and not someone else's opinion. I want you to form your own opinion from the stats that I give you. So when we look at this, what would cause our nation to be downgraded, right? We have a big economy, the largest economy in the world. We're the most advanced. We have technology, unbelievable technology and infrastructure in this country. But maybe there are things happening below the surface that the news doesn't tell us. Like, for instance, the dollar is down 15% since September. This is not a long period of time, of course, but 15% decline since September is a pretty steep decline. It continues to move around left and right, up and down, side to side, all these things. But in the end of the day, it is down 15% since September. The spending, the interest cost of our borrowing. So right now, if you look at us from a credit rating perspective, we actually owe almost 50% more than we earn. So our GDP is around 23 trillion a year. We owe about 35 trillion, depending on what they've done this afternoon. But we continue to grow our debt and shrink our actual earnings as a nation. Now our debt servicing payments are around $1 trillion a year. That's a 50% increase over the past year. If you look at the 10-year and 3-year Treasury yield spread right now, these levels are at the same levels as 1928. In 1928, it was the year before the Great Depression began, the stock market crash. It went all the way through 1933. And ironically, somebody did a great study on the buying power of a US dollar. In 1933, the buying power of a dollar was $1. Today, it's about 4 cents. You can look at the steady decade over decade decline to see this. This is what happens traditionally in financial systems, and then they swap out financial systems, which I'll get into in a further episode. But we have to look at what's happening right now. The Fed is now stating that they are open to new interest rate hikes, which I've been saying all along. They're probably not going to continue. They're not going to stop raising rates. They are going to continue to do so. This is a pathway they've set themselves on, and we need to start believing them when they say this. They all work together, these central banks around the world. The Bank of England raised their rates another 1/4 point today to 5.25%, tightening credit markets, not just here, but all around the world. Now, the Fed also has some big problems coming out. It was just disclosed that there's a $910 billion unrealized loss at the Fed, a paper loss at the Fed. This correlates with 2 weeks ago with the 4 major banks in this country coming out and saying we have anywhere between $200 and $300 billion in unrealized losses. The fact that they don't have to realize them should give you some concern to begin with. Now, America has plenty of, we have a nation full of amazing people. We have really good people in this country that are working really hard. And I think that we're making some really bad decisions, and they could be intentional. They could be accidents. That's up for God to determine. But at the same time, we have to look at big companies in this country like Pfizer. Pfizer was down 54% in Q2. You can pretty much attribute that to the fact that they're not getting huge government funding to inject people. The injection numbers are down. So we can look at that. We can look at last weekend. Heartland Tri-State Bank in the Midwest actually closed its doors and is now being operated by the FDIC. That's another bank closure, not a huge one. It's a small one, and these things do happen. But nonetheless, it's something that we should know about after seeing 2 of the 3 largest bank collapses in U.S. history over the past few months. Yellow Trucking has declared bankruptcy and has shut down operations. This is not a small 1 or 2, 3 truck operation. This is a very large shipping operation. We've already seen threatening things in our economy. You know, the UPS potential strike, which is held off or staved off by a tentative agreement. I talked about this last episode. The word tentative is in front of all these agreements. These are not permanent, finalized agreements, but UPS is still delivering packages. That's the good thing. The railroad workers, same thing, a tentative agreement. They still haven't reached a long-term agreement. The longshoremen in Long Beach, I get a lot of information there. I used to live out in that direction. I get a lot of information from people who work there. And that is a very confusing situation that I think the world needs to learn more about. We can also look at interesting things in the economy, like an antitrust lawsuit is mounting against Amazon right now. This is a good thing. Our country is run by monopolies. Google's a monopoly. Facebook's a monopoly. We have Microsoft's. There are monopolies all over this nation. So the fact that we're even mounting an antitrust lawsuit against one of these monopolies is a huge boost to my confidence. But at the same time, we also have BlackRock, which is also the biggest monopoly in the world. They're not having an antitrust lawsuit situation, but they are going through a very interesting process at the moment. They are being investigated for going against U.S. regulations and investing or getting financing for blacklisted Chinese companies. This is no small thing. This is a really big activity. So keep your eyes on that lawsuit and see what information we get out of it. Home prices in this country are down 16.9% from the peak in 2022. If you remember back in 2008, 2009, 2010, it's very, very similar structure. It almost looks identical at this point. In fact, many very intelligent people will tell you that we probably should have gone through a harder fall from our last recession in 2008, but we band-aided along the way. So these band-aids now are, we have 50 band-aids on a bullet hole wound. Eventually it's going to bleed. We also see, to give you an idea of how this real estate drop in pricing works with rising interest rates. Back in the peak in 2022, early 2022, the peak home value, average home value was $496,800 with an average mortgage payment interest rate at around 3.5%. Today, that's the equivalent of owning basically a $250,000 home with a 7.5% mortgage. So we're seeing big changes in almost every category of the world, and it comes down to the power of currency. It comes down to inflation, rates, the ability to borrow. All these things impact everything that we see. Now, here is what we actually see. This is why I'm saying propaganda doesn't stop in political news or societal news or any other news you're looking at. It bleeds into financial. The head of the Minnesota Federal Reserve, Mr. Kashkari, came out and said on television the other day, I quote, "The economy continues to surprise at how resilient it is. This came a day before we were downgraded to AA+. The day after being downgraded to AA+ as a nation, Jamie Dimon, head of one of the largest banks in the world, said that this is the best economy the world has ever seen. Janet Yellen is puzzled, quote unquote, puzzled at the recent downgrade of the United States based on our economic strength. So it's hard to tell what's what in this world that we live in right now, but I try to trust my lying eyes, what I see, what I hear, who I talk to, what common people are going through. These are the real problems we have in this country. And when places like Yellow Trucking shut down, we see lots of layoffs. Now, these problems don't come just primarily internally. They're not just coming to the United States from the United States. We're facing economic activity all across the world that's impacting our daily lives. One of the more fascinating things that I've seen is the announcement of WorldCoin, a cryptocurrency designed for global economies. People are voluntarily going around putting their eyes into an orb and giving their retina scan voluntarily to be able to use money in the future. These are desperate times that people are in if they're giving up their retina scan to get a few bucks. You're talking about a total of about $25. It's a very interesting time to be alive. BRICS. We talk about BRICS all the time. BRICS has a big summit coming up, I believe, August 22nd through the 24th in South Africa, which has its own problems. It's going through a white genocide right now, where the government is calling on people to kill the Boers or the white farmers. Many different issues are happening around the world that we all need to understand. Their summit later this month will have 74 nations. 74 nations will be going to South Africa to meet with the BRICS nations for one purpose: how to create a competitor, or better stated, how to remove the dominance of the global reserve currency, or the US dollar. Now, 18 nations have formally applied. Of those 18 nations, 5 of them are in. So obviously Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa are already in BRICS. Earlier this morning, they came out and stated that they will begin at the end of the month trading between one another in their own local currencies. So we continue to talk about who will be the next global reserve currency. I don't know if we're heading to that. I think we're heading into a technological age where we will have the ability to use blockchain and tokenization to be able to exchange goods and services in local currency that will be converted to the other local currency upon a trade. Now, the interesting thing about these 18 nations that have either are already in BRICS or who are formally applied to BRICS, you have to look at their size. They equate to around 31, almost $32 trillion of GDP. That's 1/3 of the world's GDP is actively pursuing and having conferences to avoid using the US dollar. These types of infringements have impacts, right? They do have, and by the way, not a single representative from the United States will be at this meeting. I think it's important to note that our government has done nothing to impede the progress of BRICS. I'm not a believer that BRICS will be the new global reserve currency, because I don't believe we'll have a global reserve currency, and I'm more than happy to be wrong. But at the same time, I think it's important to note what happens to a company when 1/3 of its customers stop using its product. And for all intents and purposes, the US dollar is the product of the United States that's being used by our customers, foreign nations around the world, as a store of value. What happens when 1/3 of a customer base leaves its loyalty to a product? Well, I can give you an example. It's called Bud Light. After putting Dylan Mulvaney on a Bud Light can, Bud Light lost about 1/3 of its customers. And I don't have to give you the stats. All you have to do is look at the stock chart. That's probably what's coming to the US dollar. I'm not a fortune teller, but if I had to compare what's happening to the dollar, I would compare it to what happened to Bud Light. People don't want to use our can of beer. That is essentially what's happening right now. Even small nations like Bolivia announced earlier today that they're already trading in the yuan. They're not using the US dollar at all. These small nations add up. I mean, a lot of people disregard BRICS and what it's doing because it's just a bunch of small countries. But if you put a bunch of small countries together at one time, they become one big conglomerate, and that can be one big problem for the US dollar. All the BRICS nations, aside from settling in their own currency, they have announced that later this month, a tectonic shift in the world order will occur after this meeting. I don't know what that means. There's plenty of theories out there, but I think it's something we should all pay attention to as Americans who have kids and homes and things like that. We should certainly be paying attention to this news, which is not widely broadcast. That's why I do these things. Then we have to look at Japan. Now, the nation of Japan for the last at least decade, probably a little longer, has been running in zero interest rate environments. As you do this, it's what's called a yield curve control. That's what they've deemed it. They've specifically said that they've done it to artificially inflate their economy. Now, Japan is the 3rd largest economy in the world. They're also the largest holder of US treasuries. They've recently raised their rates, making it more attractive to bring their money back home. To make this very simple, most of their money, $2 of their $3 trillion in currency that's outside of the nation, is in US treasuries. They are now in a position where they can get better yields on their own by holding it by themselves. They are run by the Bank of Japan, which is no different from the Federal Reserve. It's a central bank. The Bank of Japan already owns 81% of the stocks traded on EFTs in their nation. They own a majority of the country already, much like the Fed kind of controls our country. But this could drive trillions of dollars out of the US back into Japan, further damaging the dollar. I'm not a naysayer or doomsdayer, but at the same time, I think it's important that Americans know what's happening. There are big mounting efforts. It's not just BRICS. Japan is now a threat to the dollar, the value of the US dollar, which I believe will always be strong. I believe that this nation is the greatest nation on earth, and we will rebound from these problems as fast as any nation in the history of any economy has. But at the same time, we need to be aware of the things that are happening. Matter of fact, There are pricing issues all over the world. There's infringement all over the world. Pharmaceuticals are actually impinging on the cocaine business, which Colombia just came out and said they have economic concerns because the price of cocaine is dropping. There's a lot of funny stuff in the news, but it is kind of interesting when the price of cocaine is dropping in the midst of inflation and all these other things. It kind of tells you that the world is changing. Now, keeping our focus in that general area, we have to look at the nation of Niger. So when we're looking at global economic impact, Niger is a very interesting development that's happening. A coup has taken place to overthrow the government. Niger is like many other colony nations in Africa. They are run by large industrial companies, or countries, I should say. Niger is controlled by France. Niger does business in the franc, which isn't even used in France. And they get about 15%, France gets about 15% of the uranium for their nuclear power plants from Niger. Now, the day that this coup took place, the price of uranium went up 10%. Now, as we progress forward, I'm going to wrap up the show today with some stats on green energy and fossil fuels. Despite not liking that term, I'm going to use it because people know it. But at the same time, we have to look at the impact of this. Are these nations working or acting alone? Well, when the coup took place in Niger, the nation of Nigeria, per the calling of a foreign nation, shut off the power to Niger. In the midst of this, we're starting to see the World Bank stop giving money to the government of Niger while still providing capital for private partnerships. These are interesting things to look at. I've got a really good couple of articles that I'm digging through and talking to the writers of these articles. I will do a deep, detailed breakdown on Niger and what it may mean to the economy. But for right now, the bullet points are there's a coup, price of uranium is going up, and there's a lot of unrest happening, not just in Ukraine and Russia and the surrounding areas of Europe, but the disruption or the civil unrest is actually spreading all throughout the continent of Africa right now. These are really interesting times to live in. Now, when we look at all these things, we have to look at the power of energy. Energy powers the world. Everything that you do is becoming more energy dependent. As we get into a society where quantum computing becomes a norm or artificial intelligence becomes a standard, we have to look at the impact of energy. Without energy, every nation will fail. So if we look at what's happening in oil and gas, I'm going to do a deep breakdown into energy, but I think it's important to understand the competing energies and the logic behind it. And I know I'm going to get, a couple of haters from this, and I welcome it. It's fantastic. I'm going to speak statistically. You can speak emotionally all you like. But we have this massive push to change the way humanity lives in order to save the environment. Now, some of these pushes are becoming ridiculous. Yesterday in the Daily Mail, they put an article out basically saying that the new way to save the planet, to stop global boiling per the UN, is basically to catch an asteroid, put an umbrella on it, and block the sun. I'm not making that up. That's what's in the Daily Mail. We can't even catch whoever dropped their now cheaper cocaine in the White House, but yet we're supposed to catch an asteroid, put an umbrella on it, and block the sun. Sounds like a great idea. CNN just put out an article yesterday saying that they were going to use a technology from the 1940s called cloud seeding, and that weather manipulation and weather modification technologies have been being worked on since the 1940s. They're using this because there's a huge drought in Mexico. But at the same time, you have to wonder, why is there a gigantic rainfall in Beijing? The world is truly a crazy place. Now, in the middle of all this, we're seeing oil start to rise, natural gas slowly start to rise. But to be honest with you, as I sit with our analysts here and I talk to analysts around the country, you can kind of throw supply and demand and logic out the door. A couple of days ago, we saw a 17 million barrel draw on the supply and the price went down. We watched 2 days ago, as Iran announced they're going to increase oil production and the price went up. These don't make sense. Today, Saudi Arabia, one thing did make sense. Saudi Arabia said they're going to continue their 1 million barrel per day deficit in production. And today, correlating with that properly, the price of oil went up $2.24, which is now at $81.75. So we are going to see prices at the pump. Our last episode, we talked about last week, we had the biggest 2-day jump in the price of gasoline at the pump since 2022. So there are definitely difficulties coming ahead of time. So I want to get into some statistics before I wrap this up here today on energy and the theory out there that we need to get rid of oil, get rid of gas, get rid of coal, and go to solar and wind. I don't want to get into the argument because I don't believe there is one. I believe that the argument is over if you have any logic. And I'm going to give you some stats that just came out from the Manhattan Institute at Prager University. 84% of energy used around the world comes from coal, oil, and gas. That's down 2% over the last 20 years. During that duration, $5 trillion came from government for investment. The other $5 trillion came from private sectors. So $10 trillion, 20 years, 2% drop in dependency on fossil fuels. 97% of the consumption of oil, or excuse me, 97% of all transportation is run on the consumption of oil, 97. So if you like getting places, you probably need oil for some period of time. And that could be, I don't know, forever. Because in order for us to get to a position where a majority or even a bulk of our energy comes from sustainable energy, green energy, we are going to have to increase mining by over 1,000%, which will require diesel fuel, big machinery, which requires natural gas and power plants, more mining for materials. This will seriously put power in the hands of China, number one. They are a major, major exporter of most of the materials needed for green energy projects. Now, the energy demand conversation is fascinating to me because people keep telling me that we need less energy these days. Well, since the Industrial Revolution, since the first machine was ever made, since we went from whale blubber to burn in our homes for light and heat, ever since we switched from that into oil and gas, the demand for energy has only gone up. Most people do not understand how much materials are required to build a mobile phone. They have no idea what the cloud computing space is. And I think these stats will seriously wake people up. So it's estimated that around 80% of air travel globally is personal use. You want to go on vacation and take your family somewhere. About 80% of air travel around the world is personal use. It requires 2 billion barrels of oil a year to facilitate that air travel. Hospitals use 250% more energy than a normal commercial building. And we are building hospitals at an astronomical rate because the average lifespan of a human being is dropping. People are getting sicker. The cloud, we don't in our heads, when we think green energy, we don't really equate the fact that it takes 11 years of carbon emission to get enough materials to build an iPhone. We certainly don't equate that something in our computer could actually be damaging the environment because all I did was hit a click on a screen. Well, in order to run the cloud in its current state, just the cloud, it requires 2 times the national energy output of the entire nation of Japan. So in order to run the cloud, we need 2 times the amount of energy that the 3rd largest economy in the world needs to run their country just to support the cloud. If you think that cloud computing is going down, we probably need less energy. I tend to think that cloud computing is becoming more important as we approach the days of AI, as we approach the era of quantum computing. Energy will be important. So when you're watching this report, I'm not against green energy. We need energy, period. I don't care where it comes from. What I am against is the campaign and the lunacy behind eliminating sources of energy to shift to a new one. We don't need to eliminate energy sources. We need more of them. So if we look at this from a different perspective every day, and we just try to take in and soak in as much as we can deduce right now that the US economy has been downgraded by 2 analyst firms. We can deduce that our government doesn't see a problem with it. We can also take away from it that they have no interest in defending the US dollar as a global reserve currency, while 74 nations meet later this month. We can also deduce from this that the economy may not be as good or as robust or as resilient as they tell us. So I'd love for each of you to take a look at this, stop it, pause it, take some notes, go through everything that I told you. We have higher interest rates. Inflation is on paper disappearing, I guess. Just go to a grocery store and tell me if it's at 3%. I think we're pretty much higher than that. But use your own critical thinking, pay attention to the world around you. Make sure you spend time with your families, that you love this country. This is the greatest country in the world. And it's going to take people like us sharing this information to help everybody out. So until next time, thank you for coming and God bless you. And this program was brought to you by King Operating in Dallas, Texas, an oil and gas fund for accredited investors that offers 100% write-off for investment, monthly passive income, and a multiple on capital. Give us a call if you're interested. Thank you so much.